but I'm willing to bet most people watching this right now cannot explain exactly what it is, how it works, or why it has the power to kill legislation that the majority of Americans support. So let's fix that. Here is the simple version. In the United States Senate, passing most legislation doesn't just require a simple majority, 51 votes. It effectively requires 60 votes. Not because the Constitution says so, not because any law demands it, but because of an internal Senate rule about how long debate can last. Here's how it works. When a bill comes to the Senate floor, senators have the right to debate it, to talk about it, theoretically, for as long as they want. Now, to end debate and actually move to a vote, the Senate needs to invoke something called cloture, and cloture requires 60 votes. So if you only have 51 senators who support a bill, the other 49 can simply keep the debate open forever, or until the majority gives up. That's the filibuster. It's not a senator standing at a podium reading from a phone book for 12 hours, though that has happened. We'll get to that in a second. In the modern Senate, it's almost entirely procedural. A minority can simply threaten to keep talking, and that threat alone is enough to kill a bill. Think about that. The threat of talking is enough to stop legislation dead in its tracks. Now the word filibuster itself has a fascinating and kind of dark origin. It comes from the Dutch word vrijbuiter, meaning freebooter, which eventually became the Spanish word filibustero, which referred to pirates and mercenaries who would hijack ships and raid foreign territories without authorization. In the mid-1800s, American newspapers started using the term to describe senators who were essentially hijacking the legislative process through endless speech. Pirates. They were calling them legislative pirates. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The filibuster isn't in the Constitution at all. There is no mention of it anywhere in the founding documents. It evolved, accidentally, some historians argue, out of a rule change in 1806 when the Senate cleaned up its procedural rulebook and accidentally removed a mechanism that allowed a simple majority to force a vote. Nobody noticed what they'd done for decades. By the time the Senate figured out what had happened, the filibuster had become tradition. And in the Senate, tradition is almost as powerful as law. Now here's the real kicker, and this is the part that drives people absolutely crazy when they learn it. The filibuster has been used throughout American history disproportionately to block civil rights legislation, anti-lynching bills, voting rights, fair housing, desegregation measures. For decades, Southern senators used the filibuster as a weapon to stop the federal government from extending basic civil rights to Black Americans. The longest individual filibuster in Senate history was delivered by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina in 1957. He spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes straight, reading state election laws, the Declaration of Independence, Washington's farewell address, in an attempt to kill the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He failed. The bill passed anyway, but it was weakened during negotiations in part because of the delay he caused. That is the legacy of the filibuster. That is the tool that is still in use today, shaping what laws get passed and which ones die quietly on the Senate floor. And yet, it's not a law, it's not in the Constitution, it is an internal procedural rule that the Senate could change tomorrow if 51 senators voted to do so, which raises the obvious question, why don't they? That's complicated. And it brings us to the next piece of this puzzle. Here's a question almost nobody thinks to ask. If the Senate filibuster requires 60 votes to overcome, and getting 60 senators to agree on anything is incredibly difficult, how does the Senate get anything done? The answer is two words: unanimous consent. This is one of the most powerful and least understood mechanisms in the entire United States government, and it runs almost completely under the radar. Here's how it works. Technically, the Senate's rules are incredibly dense, elaborate. Moving a bill through every procedural step by the book could take weeks for a single piece of legislation. Quorum calls, amendments, reading the full text aloud, committee referrals. It would be a logistical nightmare if done strictly by the rules every single time. So instead, senators regularly make what are called unanimous consent agreements. One senator, usually a party leader, stands up and says, essentially, I ask unanimous consent that we skip the procedural formality and proceed directly to a vote. Or, I ask unanimous consent that debate be limited to 2 hours, divided equally between both parties. If nobody objects, not a single senator, the request passes immediately. No vote needed, no 60-vote threshold, just silence equaling consent. It sounds almost too simple, right? Almost too informal for the world's greatest deliberative body. But here's where it gets powerful and a little dangerous. Because any single senator can object, one person, and if they do, the unanimous consent request fails, instantly, and the Senate is forced back into its full grinding procedural machinery. This means that individual senators have enormous leverage. A senator who is angry about a policy decision, a nomination, a bill, anything, can single-handedly bring Senate business to a crawl just by threatening to object to unanimous consent agreements. We saw this play out dramatically in recent years when individual senators placed what are called holds on nominations in legislation, using the unanimous consent process as leverage to extract concessions, get attention on pet issues, or simply slow down an administration they opposed. One senator out of 100, with enough procedural knowledge and willpower, can stop the United States Senate from functioning normally. Now ask yourself, did you know that? Did anyone ever explain that to you? Did your high school civics class cover the actual mechanics of how 100 people manage or mismanage the business of a nation of 330 million? Of course not, because when people understand how the machine works, they start asking uncomfortable questions about who built it and who keeps it running. Okay, so we've established that passing a normal bill requires 60 votes. We've established that unanimous consent is the grease that keeps the wheels turning. Now let's talk about the escape hatch, the procedural tool that lets the party in power pass major legislation with just 51 votes. It's called reconciliation. Budget reconciliation, to be precise. Despite the boring name, this process has been used to pass some of the most consequential legislation in modern American history. Here's the basic concept. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 created a process by which the Senate can pass legislation related to the federal budget, taxes, spending, the debt ceiling, with a simple majority. 51 votes, no filibuster allowed. The rationale was practical. Budget deadlines are real. The government needs to fund itself. You can't let the filibuster grind the entire appropriations process to a halt every year. But over time, both parties figured out that budget-related could be interpreted broadly. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the massive Republican tax overhaul, passed through reconciliation. 51 votes, no filibuster. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, its final passage relied heavily on reconciliation. 51 votes. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which included historic climate investments, reconciliation, 51 votes. So here's what's really happening. The Senate has this elaborate, supposedly bipartisan structure with a 60-vote threshold designed to force compromise. But then there's this side door, reconciliation, that lets the majority party, if they're unified enough, push through major fiscal policy changes with a bare majority. The catch? There are strict rules about what can go through reconciliation. A Senate parliamentarian, an unelected, nonpartisan official, serves as the referee, applying something called the Byrd Rule to decide whether provisions are truly budget-related or are just hitching a ride on the process. The Byrd Rule, named after Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who was, for decades, the Senate's foremost expert on its own procedures. The man was basically the Gandalf of Senate process, ancient, powerful, and deeply committed to protecting the institution's rules. Under the Byrd Rule, provisions that are merely incidental to the budget can be struck from a reconciliation bill. This creates these bizarre moments where the Senate parliamentarian is essentially editing legislation, deciding what stays and what goes, based on arcane budget rules that most senators themselves barely understand. And here's the wild part. The parliamentarian's rulings can be overruled by the vice president sitting in their constitutional role as president of the Senate. That's happened. Rarely, but it has happened, which means the procedural referee can technically be overridden by the most politically motivated official in the chamber. You starting to see why people lose their minds trying to understand how laws actually get made in this country? Let's go back even further in the process, because before a bill ever hits the Senate floor, before anyone invokes cloture or calls for unanimous consent, before reconciliation is even a consideration, a bill has to survive the committee system. And this is where most legislation quietly dies, with almost no public attention. The Senate has roughly 20 standing committees: Armed Services, Finance, Judiciary, Foreign Relations, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. The one they call HELP, which has a great acronym and often produces legislation that is anything but helpful depending on who you ask. Each committee is like its own small government. It has a chair, always from the majority party, who controls the agenda, who sets the hearing schedule, which bills get a hearing, which bills get a markup. That's when the committee actually debates and amends a bill, which bills get voted out of committee and onto the Senate floor, and which bills get quietly shelved, never heard from again. The committee chair doesn't need a vote to kill a bill. They just don't schedule it. They don't hold a hearing. The bill sits in committee indefinitely, and the sponsoring senator can give interviews and send fundraising emails about it, but it goes nowhere. This happens constantly, with popular legislation, with bills that have majority support. Bills that polls show 70-80% of Americans favor can simply never get a committee hearing because the chair of the relevant committee doesn't want them to. And who are these committee chairs? They're almost always the most senior senators in the majority party. Seniority, and how long you've been in the Senate, is still a huge determinant of power. The longest-serving members get first pick of committee assignments. The longest-serving majority members get the gavels. This means the most powerful legislative gatekeepers in the country are, disproportionately, very old. The Senate's average age has hovered near its all-time high in recent years. You have senators in their late 70s and 80s chairing committees that oversee technology policy, artificial intelligence regulation, healthcare innovation, and we wonder why legislation sometimes feels like it's moving at the speed of a different century. Now we have to talk about money, because you can understand every procedural rule in the Senate, every committee, every vote threshold, and still not understand why the Senate does what it does without understanding how senators get elected and re-elected. A competitive Senate race in a major state can cost upward of $100 million. Both candidates combined. In some races, considerably more. Where does that money come from? Some of it comes from small donors, regular people giving $25 to $50, $100 via online fundraising platforms. Both parties have become extraordinarily good at small dollar fundraising, particularly through email lists and digital advertising. But a significant portion comes from large donors, political action committees, PACs, and since the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United decision, from what are called super PACs, which can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to support or oppose candidates as long as they don't coordinate directly with the campaign. That coordination restriction, by the way, is widely understood in political circles to be almost meaninglessly porous in practice. But that's a whole separate video. The point is this: senators need enormous amounts of money to get elected, and the people and organizations with enormous amounts of money to give have interests, policy interests, legislative interests. They want tax treatment favorable to their industry. They want regulatory frameworks that benefit their business model. They want trade policy that opens markets for their products. They want healthcare policy that preserves their revenue streams. And when a senator has to raise $30 million for re-election and a particular industry or donor network is willing to provide significant support, what do you think that does to the senator's legislative priorities? This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a documented, legal, structural feature of American campaign finance. Senators know who their donors are. Donors know who they're donating to. The relationship isn't usually transactional in a crude, explicit, corrupt sense. It's more subtle than that. It's about access, about which calls get returned, about which policy briefings get scheduled, about whose concerns get incorporated into legislation during the drafting phase before it ever becomes a public bill with a number attached to it. The most powerful lobbying in Washington often happens before a bill is written, not after. Shaping the language, defining the terms, building in the carve-outs and exemptions that will never make headlines but will save specific industries billions of dollars over the life of the legislation. That's the system, and senators, Democrats, and Republicans operate within it, some more comfortably than others, some with more integrity than others, but all of them have to deal with the financial reality of modern American electoral politics. Okay, I know that was a lot. I know some of that was heavy. I know it can start to feel like the whole system is rigged and nothing you do matters. I want to push back on that hard. Because here's what the cynicism narrative misses. The people who benefit most from your disengagement are the ones who designed the complexity, the opacity, the procedures that take years of study to understand, the fundraising infrastructure that makes a small number of wealthy donors feel indispensable. They want you to feel like it doesn't matter, that it's too complicated, that your voice is too small. But senators respond to constituent pressure. Not always, not fast enough, not on every issue, but they do respond, especially in competitive states, especially when they're facing re-election, especially when their phones are ringing and their inboxes are full and voters are showing up at their town halls. There's a reason lobbyists who represent people, not corporations, but actual organized movements of citizens, have scored major legislative victories throughout American history. The Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, marriage equality, veterans benefits, environmental protections. None of those happened because a senator one day decided to do the right thing in a vacuum. They happened because people organized, showed up, voted, called, ran for office themselves, built coalitions, stayed in the fight even when it felt pointless. The system is designed to be slow. It's designed to create friction. Some of that friction serves legitimate purposes, protecting minority rights, preventing hasty legislation, forcing compromise. But the friction can also be exploited by the powerful to prevent change that the majority genuinely wants. Knowing the difference, knowing when the rules are being used as intended and when they're being weaponized, that's the first step. And you can't know the difference unless you understand the rules. That's what Senate Decoded is here for. So let's bring this full circle. We started with a simple, provocative fact. 100 people control the legislative fate of 330 million Americans. But now you understand it's not just about the 100 people. It's about the architecture around them. The filibuster that requires 60 votes to overcome, a rule not found in the Constitution, born from a procedural accident, weaponized for decades to block civil rights. The unanimous consent process that makes the Senate function, but hands any single senator a hidden lever of power. Budget reconciliation, the side door that lets a bare majority pass fiscal legislation when the main door is bolted shut. Committee chairs who serve as invisible gatekeepers, deciding which bills the country gets to debate and which ones simply disappear. And the campaign finance ecosystem that quietly shapes legislative priorities before a single public hearing is ever held. This is how it works, not the civics textbook version, the real version. And here's my challenge to you. Don't stop here. Take one thing you learned in this video and go deeper. Look up who your two senators are. Find their committee assignments. Look at their top campaign contributors. It's all public information at opensecrets.org. Read the text of a bill they've sponsored. Follow a piece of legislation from introduction to vote or to its quiet death in committee. Because an informed constituent is one of the few things that actually makes a senator nervous. And a lot of informed constituents? That's how change happens. That's Senate Decoded. If this video changed how you see the system even a little, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Share it with someone who's frustrated with politics but doesn't know where to start, because frustration without information is just noise. But frustration with information, that becomes pressure. And pressure over time becomes change. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. We are just getting started here. Every week we're going in deeper. How the House works, how a bill actually becomes law versus how Schoolhouse Rock told you it does, how the Supreme Court and the Senate are more connected than most people realize, and the hidden history of the Senate, moments that changed America forever. Drop a comment below. Tell me, what's the one thing about the Senate or Congress that you've always wanted explained? Your question might become our next video. I'm Senate Decoded. Stay curious, stay informed, and never let the complexity be a reason